Okay, let's get started. All right, so we have today from yesterday kind of a very large refactoring to get through. Well, it's really a refactoring at that point. No, anyway, we have a lot of changes due to the fact that I've decided to take two concepts and pull them out of one thing. So, as a general rule of thumb, that's good coffee. As a general rule of thumb, I like one thing to do one thing. So, uh, I have metadata struct. That metadata struct should only be the metadata. Any data that is really about an individual file is about that file, and they're two separate concepts, so I don't want to have, if one bleeds into the other, I wind up with, for example, the same metadata attached to multiple different files. So we've got the metadata split out, and this helps identify um, an individual concept. This aligns with our image now. And encoding aligns with the fact that we have, for a given piece of metadata, we have multiple ways we can represent that data, right? So we could encode, as we have here, a given image that was captured on a given date as a JPEG or a TIFF, and the fact that we have the locator allows us to have, say, for example, multiple copies of some of these. So, for example, I could have the same JPEG in two different directories and then have an archival TIFF. It's still the same metadata. It still was an image captured on the same date with the same tags at the same location. But it was encoded differently. So I've got one encoding as an image JPEG at 1020 by 1024, or sorry, yeah, 1024 by 600, and I've got one encoding as a TIFF at 496 by 2160, and so this kind of deals with that. So why, you might ask, what's the big deal about the multiple files? Well, this problem originally started baking from the problem I had where I have backups, and I've been taking, backups onto hard drives for Macs for years, and I've got the same image in multiple copies of it on multiple drives, and when I consolidate it together, I've got, in some cases up to, 12 copies of the same image. And what I'd like to do is, rather than carrying around a whole bunch of excess copies of some images or movies or whatever, is to consolidate them so I have a directory that has my stuff that I want to keep backing up and preserving, and it's whittled down to the files that I actually am preserving. So rather than the 1.6 terabytes or 1.7 terabytes that I'm currently lugging around, I'm trying to find a home for on some reasonably affordable backup service. I might have more like, 500 gigs, which would still be a lot, with especially with movies. I expect some bulk, but it would be less than 1.6 terabytes. All right, so I've got my encoding, I've got my locations, and I've got my locator, which is an interface because right now, although I only have file locations, we could have images that are in an API somewhere or in a bucket in Amazon or something. And so, we'd want to be able to identify that those buckets are somewhere or that data somewhere. Uh, so pgmock. There we go. Okay. All right, so we've got our dependencies. There's nothing broken. We've got a lot of fix-me's. So going back to the metadata service, what do we expect our result type to look like? So we kind of expect it to look like this. And we expect the scan to return back these fields. So we've got the ID, we've got the date, we've got tags down here. We've got location. So date, tags, location, duration moves down the stack. So if we look at our database, we see that metadata now has date captured, location, and tags. Right? Date captured, location, and tags. They're reversed up here. Then we've got wait a second. Let's see something. So what is the query builder really going to generate for us? So let's go into let's go do this. So we've determined that the metadata, the query builder is going to return fields in this order. So let's make sure the fields are in that order. Select metadata ID, check. Date captured, check. Location, check. Tags, checked. Encoding ID. So let's just add encoding ID, encoding runtime, encoding resolution, and this is a type that we've mapped so that we should get back a fully formed object instead of just fields. Encoding MIME type. Encoding file hash. Locator ID. location source, location path. Okay, that's what our row should look like. So this would be the same thing. Oops. This would be 1, 10, 100. This would be 1, 11, no, this would be 1, 10, 101. This would be 2. Okay, so this is, let me move these up here. They're out of the way. So this would be metadata 1, and it would be encoding 10. So it's called encoding foo at a given location. So this is the same metadata, same encoding at a different location. This is the same metadata, different encoding let's make this a TIFF at TIFF. Okay, so this has the same metadata 3 times, 2 encodings, and 2 locations at one of the encodings. So there are a total of 3 files that represent the data. So now let's add another row. Oh, I see why I did it. There we go. I think the indentation algorithm doesn't deal with it as well if it's fluent and spanning this many lines or something like that. Anyway, long story short, so this is 12, this is 104. So I'll just make this work for sake of argument. And this is Baz Quux. And it's got MIME JPEG. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm expecting. Now for single row, let's go ahead and well, let's do this. Let's add our worst case. So let's go ahead and add this to the single row. Right? So what this represents is a call to a single metadata, which returns back 3 rows. So we would expect one metadata object to get, excuse me, to come back with 2 encodings attached to it and 2 locations for one of the encodings. Okay, great. Okay. And again, you might be asking, aren't you duplicating a bunch of data here? And in fact, I'm kind of doing something that would normally be done when returning lots of results like this from the database. So conceptually, let's say I've got an average of 1.5 encodings and an average of 2 locations per encoding. So that's an average of 4. Let's say 3. Let's say this is our average, 3 rows back, and I'm returning back a result set that could be say 25 metadata records. So 25 metadata records times 1.5 encodings is 3, which is 30 encodings, right? So I've got at least 20. So I get results that I go to the database once, get 20 back, then I go back to the database. Let's say I pass the database an array of IDs so that I don't have to go back and forth for each. So now I've got a second trip to get back the 30, and then I've got another trip to get back the locators. So rather than have all these multiple trips and having to pass these big long lists of IDs to get the next set, which, by the way, if I'm returning back a query of 100, it becomes even, I have to pass even more IDs. But long story short, rather than taking these multiple trips to the database, I go ahead and join them in the database and return back the joined results, which means I have multiple rows with the same stuff, but my deserialization, or when I rehydrate the object from a database return back into a live object, I should have only one metadata record, for example. Okay. All right. So those to-dos are gone. And notice I'm starting from the test here because I want the test to fail before I fix the source code. Okay, so now the query is going to change, right? So I know, because I've tested my builder, and I'm taking these from the expected builder results. Just grab a whole one. Yeah, so um, that should be what we expect, and for that, we'll return back the single result. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this test now that I fixed it. Failed. Okay, so that's totally expected. So let's go to find by ID. There we go, find by ID. So that in turn just calls process rows. So process rows needs to change, right? So let's go put our query up here so we know what we're processing. Right, so we've got we got ID, date, location, that's good. Runtime. So ID, date, location, tags. Let's go ahead and close this down here so we have a little more room. ID, date, location, tags. Great. Now we've got let's go fix those names too. Encoding ID, runtime, resolution. MIME type. And file hash, right? And now I'm left with locator ID. Source path. Okay. That is what my scan should look like. My outermost object is the metadata. My second outer object is the encoding. Okay. So if current ID is less than 0, we set the current ID to ID. And at this point we have a new metadata. Actually in this case we have the first metadata. And if this happens, then we have new metadata. And if we have new metadata, we add the old metadata, add old metadata to result, create new empty. Okay. So now we set the fields for the metadata. If well, so let's think this through. So so we've got option 1. New metadata, no current locator. Okay. In which case, we create a new locator, populate its fields, and add it to the, we're going to add it to the result metadata. We're going to add it to the current metadata. Option 2. So that's what happens when we have no locators. Option 2, new locator ID. So in this case, what we have is second or later locator for a metadata. So in this case, what do we want to do? So we want to create a new locator, populate its fields, option 3. We have a second file, second or later file for a locator. So we don't create a new locator, we don't populate its fields. What are we doing? We're just, that's what we forgot up here. Okay. So in this case, we're just going to add the new location. You know what? I don't think we're going to do this. I think it's going to be create the new locator, populate its field, add the new location. I'm thinking this can be add the current locator to the metadata. I'm sorry, add the current encoding to the metadata. Create a new encoding. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. I screwed up. We're talking about adding encodings to metadata, not locators. So I've got new metadata with no current encoding. I create the new encoding, I populate its field, and then I add the new location. Option 2, I have a new encoding ID. So the encoding ID does not, let's do this. Set the current encoding ID. Populate its fields and add the new location. So option 2, I've got a new encoding ID, and this is the second or later encoding for metadata. I add the current encoding to the metadata. Okay. Create a new encoding. Set the new current encoding ID. Populate its fields. No longer doing this. Add the new location. Finally, we've got option 3. The same encoding ID coder. File location. Okay, so let's walk through this. So I have new metadata. There's no current encoding. So I create the new encoding. I set the current encoding ID. So I create a new current encoding. Set the current encoding ID, populate the current encoding fields, add the new location to the current encoding. New encoding ID. That means we've got the same metadata ID, but there's a second encoding for that same metadata. Second or later encoding for metadata. So we add the current encoding to the metadata. Create a new current encoding. Set the new current encoding ID. Populate the current encoding IDs fields, and then add the new location. And the same encoding ID. So in this case, it's the same encoding, but I just have another file for it. So I just add the new location. Okay. So regardless of anything else, we are going to take location data And it's just path, right? All of these do the same thing at the end. Okay. Now, option one. Option one, how do we tell it's a new metadata? Well, for one thing, if len, so if the length of the, oh no. So let's take a look at what happens if I do it. Okay. So current encoding So let's set this to -1. Okay, so let's set the current encoding ID. So it's the same thing that I have here. If current encoding ID less than 0, so I know I have oops. Sorry, I was working some Python earlier or yesterday. All right, so current encoding ID is less than 0. That's how we know we've got a new. Actually, we know that up here, right? So we know we've got a new metadata up here. Okay, create the new current encoding. ID is going to be the encoding ID, and the current encoding ID is encoding ID. So that creates a new current encoding. Setsync populates the current encoding's fields. So the current encoding fields are runtime, resolution, MIME type, and hash. Right? Yes. Okay. Add the location of the current encoding. So that's done down here. Okay, option 1 is done. Option 2, new encoding ID. Second or later encoding for metadata. So in this case, I can add a new case, current encoding ID. Oh, before I do that, this is also new metadata, right? So the same thing, and I'm just going to copy and paste for now, knowing that that's going to make some people go nuts, but let's just start with this. So it adds the current no, so this is no, we're still working on option 1, new metadata, no current encoding. So we create the new current encoding, populate the current encoding ID, populate its fields, and we have it. Okay, so option 1 is done. Option 2, new encoding ID. So in this case, okay. So in this case, metadata. Okay, add the current encoding in the metadata. Okay, that's done. Create a new encoding. Set the encoding. So this happens. And then finally, same encoding ID. Just add a new location. Okay. Let's go fix this. So Okay, so this is a new now. What could happen on the last one? So what could happen on the last one? On the last one, what can happen is we have current metadata that hasn't been added to the result set. The other thing we could have is we could have a current, let's clear out these old comments. So we can have an encoding that hasn't been added to the resulting metadata, and that's because on the last time through we don't hit this, of course. That's only the first time through. We don't hit this, of course, because the ID isn't changing. And we may hit this. This always gets appended. So if we hit this, what's happened is we had an encoding. Now we've got a new encoding. So there's a current encoding that hasn't been added to the metadata. So append result, append current data, metadata, data, current encoding. Okay, that should do it. Let's tighten some of these up. Path, file, hash, mime, type. There. Nope, doesn't quite work that way. Okay. So just because I'm paranoid, I'm going to walk through it again. So if the first time we hit this, the current ID and the current encoding ID are both -1. So current ID less than 0. We have our first metadata ever. So we populate the metadata, we populate the encoding, we set the current IDs. We only hit this when we move on to new metadata, in which case we need to save the current metadata, create a new current metadata, capture new current ID, create new encoding, and capture the new encoding ID. Now if the encoding changes, Aha. So in this case, we haven't, of course we'll have a new encoding ID for a given metadata because they're not shared. So because they're not shared, I'll have a current encoding that hasn't been added. So I do need to add the current encoding. And that should logically, even though it doesn't make a difference, should come before this. So save off, because we're going to have a new encoding. We know we're going to have a new encoding. We save off the existing current encoding. We save off the current metadata. We create a new metadata. We need a new current encoding. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's go back to our tests. You can write from here. Oh wow, really super unhappy with that. Expecting the number of values to match the number of columns. So if we look at this, oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, the other thing we need to do, before I forget, is lots of little escaping. Because this functions effectively as a space insensitive regular expression. So just run again. Expected number of values does not match number of columns. So let's go back to return single row. Okay, ID, date captured, location. Aha! I didn't fix it there either. So it would be ID, date captured, location, tags, encoding, what do you runtime, resolution, Okay, so let's count these. So ID, date, location, tags, encoding ID, runtime, resolution, MIME type, file hash, locator ID, source. Okay, those match. Okay. Oh, fixed it for the wrong one. Okay, now let's try it. Oh. Select. Yep. Where's find by ID? There's find by ID. All right, so that test works. Okay. So let's move on to instead of doing the general find. Let's do the general find. So this stays the same. And the order by changes. Right. But I don't expect these things to change. Okay, this is what I expect now. So what do I have here in my results? I've got one metadata that has two encodings, and one encoding has two locations. And then a single. Okay. So I'm expecting 4? Yes, 4. So I would expect 4 of these. No, I expect 2 of these. So I would expect 2 metadata, or 2 encodings. And I could stop there if that isn't correct, because this next one does depend on it being correct. So data dot locator expected got okay. So expect the next one to be 1. All right. Okay, let's run the general query here. Okay, passed. So I got my 4 rows total returned from the database, right? I've got 2 metadata, but one metadata has 2 encodings, and one encoding has 2 locations. So that's 1, 2, 3 results for the first metadata, 1 results for the second. That's 4 total results. And those are the things that I expected. Let's go in here a little bit and make sure so the first one I expect is a JPEG, and second one I expect is a TIFF. So if I run it again, it should still pass. Let's check the resolution. So what do we have as expected results for the resolution? Let's make these 1920 by 1080. 1920 by 1080. Let's make this shorter. All right, just run it. And we will do res and that's 1024 by 600. Run again real quick. Okay, I think that's working. Okay, so now so we expect the select and join to be the same. That's not going to change, but the order clause is. Let's go ahead and pretty indent that. So I've already kind of tested the construction of the structs here. So I'm really not going to do that. I'm really just testing to make sure that this operates. And this is what I'm expecting when I don't include any query parameters. Just give me everything, right? I don't expect this to change. Let's pretty indent that, and I expect the order to change, right? Okay. And again, I kind of tested the row processing. So I'm expecting different headers. That doesn't change. So the first part. And the order by. That passed. Oh, what was the fix me? Okay. This doesn't change. All right. Fix the order by. Go back up here and grab this, since that is the same in all my queries. Expecting that one to pass. Yes, it does. Okay. So that is almost all the work I need to do here. The only thing that's left is adding a test for find by MIME type. Okay, I'm going to leave that to tomorrow. That's going to be it for today. And I will